October 1944. A muddy motorpool near Nancy, France. Heavy gray rain beats down on canvas tents and grease-stained gravel. Mechanics move between rows of heavy trucks and light utility vehicles, tools clinking against wet steel. A massive supply convoy arrived only 3 hours ago, delivering 50,000 gallons of fuel to keep the Third Army moving eastward. Now, the quiet routine of the maintenance yard shatters into chaos. One after another, heavy truck engines cough, sputter, and die with a metallic clang. Smoke thick with the smell of scorched metal pours from under the hoods. Blue-gray exhaust hangs low in the damp autumn air. Drivers turn ignitions over and over, but the starters only click. 14 cargo trucks stand completely immobilized. 6 light utility jeeps sit dead with ruined cylinders. A critical mistake has just paralyzed the frontline mobility of an entire unit. Patton will force the bureaucracy to swallow its own poison. This is the story of what happened when 20 vital frontline vehicles were destroyed by a single careless labeling error, and the military supply chain chose bureaucratic evasion over accountability. It is a chronicle of administrative buck-passing that met a sudden, unyielding end. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the order that came from a desk, not a foxhole. Master Sergeant Frank Duca was 34 years old. He came from the hard-fought neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and ran the motorpool for the Third Army. Before the war, he had spent 12 years turning wrenches in a commercial garage, learning the precise tolerances of combustion engines by touch and sound. He had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a wife and 2 young daughters to apply his trade in uniform. Duca had seen the grueling trek across France, repairing vehicles under artillery fire and salvaging spare parts from burned-out wrecks, just to keep his unit operational. He took immense personal pride in the mechanical readiness of his fleet, viewing every functional engine as a direct contribution to the safety of his men. When the trucks began to fail under his watch, he immediately recognized the danger and stopped the remaining vehicles before the entire fleet was ruined. Major Reginald Vance was 41 years old and served as the commander of the Regional Fuel Distribution Depot. Born into a wealthy shipping family from Boston, Massachusetts, Vance viewed his military commission as an administrative exercise rather than a combat duty. He operated out of a pristine office far behind the front lines, wearing a tailored wool uniform and highly polished leather boots that had never touched battlefield mud. Vance believed entirely in the infallibility of the supply chain, operating under the rigid ideology that the bureaucracy was never wrong if the paperwork was complete. He had never experienced the desperate urgency of a frontline shortage, and he treated the moving of critical war supplies like accounting entries on a ledger. To Vance, a discrepancy in the field was always someone else's problem, provided his own ledgers balanced at the end of the day. When notified that his depot had shipped aviation fuel instead of vehicle gasoline, his immediate response was to point to his immaculate manifests and deny any personal liability for the dead vehicles. By October 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had turned into a desperate race against the calendar and the elements. The rapid dash from the Normandy beaches had severely stretched the logistics network to its absolute breaking point. Every single drop of fuel, every crate of ammunition, and every ration pack had to be hauled hundreds of miles from the coast by truck convoys. The frontline combat units were consuming resources faster than the rear echelon depots could deliver them, creating a frantic atmosphere where speed was prioritized over scrutiny. In this chaotic environment, systemic breakdowns became increasingly common as exhausted personnel hurried through their tasks to meet overwhelming quotas. The pressure to maintain the momentum of the advance meant that administrative protocols were frequently bypassed or ignored entirely. In many sectors of the theater, senior commanders had simply chosen to overlook these recurring logistical errors. They accepted a certain percentage of supply losses as an unavoidable cost of rapid modern warfare, preferring to bury the discrepancies in paperwork rather than halt their operations. Broken parts, misdirected shipments, and mixed-up cargo were routinely written off by officers who did not want to risk slowing down their advance to fight the rear-guard bureaucracy. This passive acceptance had allowed a dangerous culture of corporate unaccountability to take root within the vast network of supply depots feeding the front. Clerks and depot commanders grew accustomed to shifting blame whenever shipments went awry, knowing that the combat units would usually find a way to adapt or scrounge for replacements. But this institutional negligence created a direct threat to the Army's mobility, leaving the fighting forces vulnerable to the catastrophic failures of a broken chain of distribution. Back in the wet mud near Nancy, that exact vulnerability had just paralyzed the entire motorpool. Captain Robert Evans, the maintenance officer for the division, walked into Major Vance's clean office at the fuel depot. He carried a handful of bent metal parts and a thick manila folder containing Duca's initial findings. "Major Vance, we have a catastrophic issue with the fuel shipment delivered to our motor pool this morning," Captain Evans said, placing the folder directly on the immaculate desk. 14 cargo trucks and 6 jeeps have suffered severe engine detonations within hours of filling up. Major Vance did not look up from his ledger immediately, carefully completing a line of text before raising his eyes to the captain. "That is an issue for your maintenance team." "Captain," Vance replied, his voice smooth and entirely unbothered, "our responsibility ends once the drums leave the loading platform. The fuel itself is the problem, sir," Evans said, stepping closer to the desk. Master Sergeant Duca sampled the drums and confirmed they contain high-octane aviation fuel, not standard vehicle gasoline. "The drums were mislabeled at your filling station, and the fuel is literally melting our pistons." Vance leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smile touching his lips as he tapped the cover of his logbook. "My manifests are absolutely flawless, Captain. Every single line item matches the distribution orders issued by Theater Command, so there is no error on our end. With all due respect, Major, the labels on the drums are wrong," Evans escalated, his voice tightening as he pointed at the paperwork. "Your depot filled those specific drums, which means your personnel attached the wrong markings to the containers. We have 20 dead vehicles sitting in the mud because of that specific labeling error. If the labels are incorrect, that is a drum-filling error at the point of origin, not a distribution error by my staff," Vance said, his tone sharpening with institutional arrogance. "The filling station operates under a separate administrative code, so you need to take your complaints to the manufacturing coordinators. I will not accept liability for a mechanical failure caused by your driver's inability to check their own tanks. This isn't about liability, Major. It's about 20 combat vehicles lost to our advance," Evans said, his politeness fading completely. "The supply system broke them, and we need immediate replacements from the theater pool to maintain our mobility. Then, you can file a formal request through the standard bureaucratic channels, and it will be reviewed in due course," Vance answered, dismissing the captain with a slight wave of his hand. "I do not bend the regulations for motorpool negligence." Captain Evans realized instantly that this administrative wall was far too high for his rank to break down. He picked up his folder, turned on his heel without saluting, and walked straight to the field telephone. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate of the regional fuel depot. 4 polished stars gleamed on his helmet, and his signature ivory revolvers rested squarely on his belt. The general walked into the building unannounced, his presence immediately cutting through the quiet comfort of the administrative office. Clerks froze at their desks, and the faint rustle of paper vanished instantly. Patton walked directly to Major Vance's desk, his eyes cold and entirely focused on the comfortable officer. He did not raise his voice, but the low cadence of his words commanded absolute attention from everyone in the room. "Major, how many vehicles under my command are currently dead in the mud?" Patton asked. 20, General, Vance stammered, pulling himself to a rigid salute. "But as I explained to the captain, the paperwork. Did those 20 vehicles suffer combat damage from enemy artillery?" Patton cut in, his voice dropping a fraction. "No, sir. It was a labeling error at the filling station," Vance replied quickly. "Are you the commanding officer of this logistic facility?" Patton asked. "Yes, General, but the responsibility lies with the manufacturer," Vance said. Patton studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching until it felt heavier than the rain outside. He stepped closer to the desk, his gaze dropping to the pristine leather boots Vance wore. "You sit behind a desk in a dry room, surrounded by immaculate ledgers and perfect records," Patton said. "You look at your numbers and you see compliance, while my men look at 20 dead engines and see a broken line of advance. You believe that an error wrapped in a correct manifest is no longer an error. You are mistaken. In the field, a mistaken supply is just as lethal as a German ambush." Master Sergeant Duca spent 12 years learning the precise realities of steel and fuel so he could keep our men moving forward. He does his job in the mud, while you hide from yours behind an administrative regulation. You have chosen to let 20 vehicles rot because admitting a mistake might stain your precious ledger. The supply chain does not exist to protect your career from liability. It exists to feed the fighting edge of this army. If my mechanics must test every drop of fuel before it enters a tank because your station cannot be trusted to read a label, then you have failed your primary duty. You have two options, Major. You will personally secure 20 identical replacement vehicles from the theater pool and have them delivered to Duca's motorpool before midnight. Or you will be stripped of your rank and placed in charge of the manual drum washing detail at the forward fuel dump. Decide now." Major Vance looked at the unyielding expression on the general's face, his face turning pale as his administrative confidence completely evaporated. He swallowed hard and reached for the telephone. The replacement vehicles arrived at the Nancy motorpool exactly 3 hours before the midnight deadline. Master Sergeant Duca stood in the driving rain, watching 20 fresh, factory-line trucks and jeeps roll into the gravel yard under the command of Major Vance himself. The comfortable depot commander was forced out of his dry office and into the cold mud, his immaculate wool uniform soaked through and his polished leather boots caked in wet clay. Under the watchful eyes of Patton's staff officers, Vance had to stand by the fuel drums in the downpour, while Duca implemented a rigorous new inspection protocol. Every single container was cracked open, sampled, and tested for correct octane grades right in front of the man who had claimed his paperwork was flawless. The mechanics worked in silence, their flashlights cutting through the dark, as they verified the fuel before a single drop entered an engine tank. Frontline drivers stood by, watching the humble depot chief endure the exact elements his bureaucracy had ignored. The message across the entire sector was unmistakable. Patton had physically extracted the replacements from the very system that had broken them, proving that the mobility of the combat units would always override the comfort of the rear echelon. Master Sergeant Frank Duca returned to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After the war concluded in late 1945, he went back to his family and reopened his commercial garage, operating the business successfully for another 3 decades. He rarely discussed his wartime service with his customers, but he kept a single brass fuel valve on his workshop desk until his death in 1978. Major Reginald Vance faced a quiet but decisive bureaucratic reassignment shortly after the fuel incident. His dreams of a post-war corporate logistics career faded as he was transferred to a remote processing depot in Western or Central Europe. He was passed over for promotion twice and eventually retired from the military in 1952, spent his remaining years in Massachusetts, and died bitter in 1969. General George S. Patton did not mention the confrontation at the fuel depot in his public briefings or official statements. He did, however, write a brief, candid entry about the event in his personal diary that very night. He noted that a frontline commander must fight the rearguard paperwork just as hard as the enemy. Some historians have argued that General Patton's heavy-handed intervention at the Nancy fuel depot was an unnecessary overreach that disrupted the established administrative chain of command. They contend that by threatening a commissioned logistics officer with manual labor, he undermined the formal channels of military authority and created friction between frontline combat operations and vital rear echelon support networks. Conversely, other historical analysts argue that this aggressive action was entirely justified by the desperate realities of the autumn advance. They maintain that a rigid bureaucracy left unchecked would have continued to dodge accountability while frontline mobility deteriorated. What is certain is that the fuel testing protocol, established that afternoon, remained a permanent fixture of the division's logistics for the remainder of the European campaign. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have accepted the bureaucratic delays to preserve the formal chain of command? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more stories about the order that came from a desk, not a foxhole, make sure to subscribe.